On one night in June 2026, 12,700,000 screens turned on simultaneously to watch a football match on YouTube, not on television. On YouTube, the largest live sports audience ever recorded on any internet platform in the history of the medium. The channel that said it had not existed 4 years earlier, and the monopoly it broke had taken 40 years to build. For 40 years, two companies decided what 200 million Brazilians could watch when the World Cup was on. That was not an accident. It was an architecture built deliberately over decades, designed to make itself impossible to challenge. Rights were expensive. Production was complex. The barriers to entry were so high that even trying to compete required resources that only the incumbents already had. It was a perfect closed system, and it worked exactly as designed for 4 decades. The monopoly that had seemed permanent was gone. The architecture that had taken 40 years to build had collapsed in approximately 4 years, and the way it collapsed tells you something important, not just about Brazil, not just about sports broadcasting, but about what happens to any industry when the thing it has been using as its primary competitive advantage stops being scarce. This is the story of how the most powerful gatekeepers in Brazilian television history lost control of the only thing that made their gate worth guarding. How the gate was built to understand what fell? You need to understand what was standing. From the late 1970s onward, Globo built the most complete stranglehold on Brazilian sports broadcasting that any single company has ever held over any major market. It was not dominance in the casual sense of having the largest market share. It was structural control, the kind where competitors are not just smaller, but functionally absent, where the audience has no meaningful alternative, and where the rights holders, the clubs and federations, are so dependent on a single buyer that they have no real negotiating power. The mechanism was straightforward. Sports broadcasting rights are only valuable if you can get them in front of an audience. To get rights in front of an audience, you need distribution, the infrastructure that carries the signal to millions of homes simultaneously. In the era before the internet, that infrastructure was enormously expensive, technically complex, and heavily regulated. Building it from scratch was not a viable option for a competitor. And Globo, which had been building its network since the 1960s, had more of it better coverage and deeper penetration into Brazilian homes than any rival could match. This created a feedback loop that reinforced itself over decades. Globo could afford to pay more for rights than anyone else because it could convert those rights into advertising, revenue that no one else could match. The higher it paid, the less accessible the rights became to competitors. The fewer competitors existed, the more the rights holders depended on Globo as their primary market. The more they depended on Globo, the more power Globo had to set terms. And the more power Globo had to set terms, the more advertising revenue it generated, funding the next cycle of rights acquisition. The World Cup was the crown of this arrangement. FIFA awarded the Brazilian broadcasting rights in packages that Globo purchased at prices reflecting the fact that, for practical purposes, Globo was the only buyer with the audience infrastructure to make those rights valuable. The deal worked for FIFA, which got the maximum extractable revenue from the Brazilian market. It worked for Globo, which got the content that made its advertising inventory the most valuable in the country. And it worked for the Brazilian clubs and federation, which received stable income from a buyer that had never missed a payment. What it did not do was work for anyone who wanted to enter the market. The gate was locked. The key was Globo's, and the structure had been designed to make sure it stayed that way. For fans, the consequences were invisible in the way the monopoly consequences always are when you have never experienced the alternative. You watched the World Cup the way Globo showed it to you. You heard the narrators Globo chose. You saw the camera angles Globo decided on. You accepted the broadcast as if it were the game itself because you had no basis for comparison. The game and the broadcast had been the same thing for so long that the distinction had stopped feeling relevant. This is, historically, what monopolies do. They do not just control markets. They control what people understand as normal. The fault lines, the architecture was solid, but underneath it, starting around 2015, the ground was moving in ways that the people inside the building were slow to register. The first movement was behavioral. A generation of Brazilians had begun consuming media on fundamentally different terms than the generation before them. They watched on phones and computers, in environments where they could talk back, comment in real time, share reactions, and be part of an experience rather than an audience. They were less patient with formality. They were deeply allergic to the broadcast convention of treating the audience as passive recipients of what producers decided to show them, and they had grown up with the internet's most significant gift to consumer expectations, the belief that most things should be free. This last point is critical and systematically underestimated by the old industry. Subscription television had spent decades training audiences to accept that premium sports content required payment. What the internet era produced was a generation that had strong reasons to believe that everything worth watching was available at no cost, if you knew where to find it. Convincing that generation to pay for sports content that could, in some form, be found elsewhere was a harder commercial problem than it appeared to be, and getting harder every year. The second movement was legal. In 2021, a Brazilian law called the Lei do Mandante came into force. The technical details mattered enormously. The law gave each football club the right to negotiate the transmission rights for matches played at its home stadium. For decades, those rights had been sold in a single consolidated package, and whoever bought the package controlled the totality. The new law fractured that consolidation. Rights could now be disaggregated, sliced, and sold in pieces by individual clubs or smaller groupings. The practical impact was not immediately visible. The clubs had been selling as a package because that was what the market demanded. But the legal possibility of a different structure now existed. A buyer willing to approach individual clubs or smaller groups of clubs with a different kind of proposition had an opening that had not existed before. The door that Globo had locked from the inside had been unlatched from outside. What no one inside the established structure had fully calculated was what would happen when these two forces combined with a third element, an audience asset that had been built outside the industry entirely by someone who had no stake in preserving the old system. The weapon that changed the equation. Casemiro Miguel Vieira da Silva Ferreira had started his media career earning 500 reais a month as an intern at a sports channel. He understood the inside of the television industry because he had spent almost 8 years in it, learning how the machine worked at Esporte Interativo and later as a commentator at SBT. He also understood, from that inside position, what the machine could not do. The money was not the point, though money was the first objective. His father, a Portuguese immigrant named Amadeu, had been standing behind the counter of a pastry restaurant in South Rio for as long as Casemiro could remember. The son had made himself a quiet promise. He was not particularly interested in being famous. He was interested in being the specific reason Amadeu got to put down the countercloth and rest. Everything that followed was built, at least initially, on the radius of that promise. Television formality was not a technical limitation. It was a cultural commitment. Broadcast conventions existed because they had always existed, because they projected authority and professionalism, because the audience had been trained to expect them, and because changing them would have required every institution that depended on them to admit they were optional. That kind of institutional self-examination does not happen voluntarily. It happens when something outside the institution demonstrates that the conventions were choices, not necessities. Casemiro demonstrated this, not by arguing against television, but by doing something television could not replicate, starting in 2018. First on Twitch, and increasingly on other platforms, he built a relationship with a football audience based on the specific kind of intimacy that mass media cannot manufacture. The feeling of watching sport with a friend, not a professional broadcaster maintaining journalistic distance, a person who actually cared, who reacted the same way his audience reacted, who got nervous and excited and furious and joyful in real time, and who made the people watching feel that they were sharing the experience rather than receiving a broadcast of it. By 2022, the numbers around him were so large they had become impossible for the industry to dismiss. He had set records on Twitch. He had become, briefly, the live content creator with the most paid subscribers anywhere on the platform. The pandemic had accelerated his growth by creating an audience that was isolated and wanted company. And the company he provided was specific enough to generate genuine loyalty rather than passive viewership. This is the asset that broke the monopoly. Not technology, not investment capital, not a superior broadcast infrastructure. An audience that trusted one specific person more than it trusted any of the institutions that had been deciding what it could watch for 40 years. The financial infrastructure that would weaponize that trust came from two executives named Edgar Deines and Sergio Lopes, who had built their own smaller disruption of the sports broadcast market years earlier. Their company, Live Mode, had spent years acquiring and managing disaggregated rights under the new legal framework. They had the contracts, the relationships with clubs and federations, and the knowledge of how rights markets actually functioned. They did not have the audience. When they partnered formally with Casemiro in January 2022, they brought together the two things that the incumbent had never needed to combine, because it had always had both, their rights and their reach. What they were about to do, that combination had been enabled by a third party that had not intended to help them. Globo itself, which had acquired the traditional broadcasting rights to the 2022 Qatar World Cup but had decided not to retain exclusivity in the streaming space. The digital rights were available. Live Mode, acting as FIFA's digital rights agent in Brazil, acquired them for a figure reported by financial journalists at approximately $3 million. For context, Globo was paying FIFA approximately $90 million per year for its rights package. The digital rights to the most watched sporting event on earth were available at a fraction of 1% of that figure, because without a distribution infrastructure, digital rights are inert. They had never needed to be expensive before, because there had never been anyone capable of making them valuable. There was now. The first attack in November 2022, Cascavel launched as a formal business. The plan, as stated publicly, was modest. Transmit 22 games from the Qatar World Cup, free on YouTube. The Brazilian television establishment did not respond with alarm. There was no visible sense of threat from a YouTube channel was going to broadcast a fraction of a World Cup with someone who streamed video games. It did not seem like the beginning of the end of a 40-year order. The first match of the Brazilian national team against Serbia drew 3,480,000 simultaneous viewers, the largest live broadcast in the history of YouTube in Brazil. At that point, against Switzerland, 4 million. Against South Korea, 5 million. And in the quarterfinal against Croatia, the match that eliminated Brazil on penalty kicks, the channel reached nearly 7 million screens connected simultaneously, a world record for a sports broadcast on the entire platform. Stop here for a moment, because the specifics of what those numbers mean deserve attention. Globo was broadcasting the same match on free-to-air television, reaching every home with an antenna, with the production infrastructure of the largest media company in Latin America. With narrators and commentators, the audience had been watching for decades on screens that for most Brazilian families were already on. Cassette was broadcasting from YouTube, with a delay of a few seconds behind a live signal, accessible on phones and computers and smart TVs, with a presenter who had built his name on gaming streams. Millions of people looked at both options and chose the YouTube stream. They were not choosing because the production was superior. They were not choosing because the access was easier or the quality was better or the convenience was greater. In most respects, the conventional broadcast was the more friction-free choice. They were choosing because the experienced on cassette felt like being in a room with people who cared about the same things they cared about, rather than being addressed from a studio by professionals maintaining the appropriate broadcast distance from the event. This is the distinction that the old industry had systematically failed to understand, and that failure had roots going back to the basic premise on which broadcast television was built. The premise was, we control what you can watch, so you will watch what we give you. That premise had been true for so long that it had stopped feeling like a premise. It had become an assumption about human nature, about what audiences were and how they behaved. Qatar 2022 did not just demonstrate that the premise was wrong, it demonstrated that the premise had been wrong for years, that the audience had simply had no alternative until one appeared, and that the moment an alternative existed that met their actual preferences, the switch was immediate and large. After Qatar, the structure of Brazilian sports broadcasting was different in a way it could not recover from, because the demonstration had been public and the numbers had been reported. The clubs that had always assumed Globo was the only viable buyer for their rights had seen an alternative buyer attract 7 million viewers to a single match. The advertisers, who had always directed their sports budgets primarily toward broadcast television, had seen an audience of that scale on a platform they had considered supplementary. The ecosystem shifted not because anyone in the old industry had made a strategic decision to change, but because the proof of an alternative had entered the public record and could not be withdrawn. The systematic dismantling. Imagine you are ahead of sports programming at Globo in early 2023. You have just watched a YouTube channel set the record for the largest live audience in Brazilian streaming history. You have told yourself that Qatar was an anomaly. One exceptional presenter, one exceptional moment, an audience that will return to normal when the novelty wears off. You are waiting for the correction! Instead, the phone starts ringing. A club from the Brasileira that had been a reliable part of the consolidated package for 15 years wants to talk. Then another. The Paulistão Clásico between São Paulo and Corinthians draws 6 million viewers on a platform you do not operate. A Women's World Cup match generates more online attention than your primetime lineup. The Euro 2024 Portugal game hits 7 million. Copa America! The correction is not coming. The phone is not stopping. What followed Qatar was not spontaneous. It was a methodical expansion along the lines of weakness in the old structure. The Lei do Mandante had created the legal right to buy rights, club by club. Live Mode and Casat used it. They began acquiring transmission rights for matches in the Brasileirão. The National League, approaching clubs individually with propositions that the old package deal structure had made impossible. State championships followed, including the Paulistão, where classic derby matches drew audiences above 6 million on YouTube. The Copa do Brasil, the Women's World Cup, the 2024 European Championship, the Copa America. Each new competition represented territory that the old monopoly had either held or considered too marginal to defend seriously. This strategy exploited something the television monopoly had built into itself as a structural vulnerability without recognizing it. When you control the totality of broadcasting rights as a single package, you also make a single decision about what is worth showing. The World Cup was always worth showing. The National Championship was always worth showing. But the women's game, the Olympic sports, the regional competitions, the second-tier national events, these had been systematically undercovered, not because there was no audience for them, but because the economics of broadcast television made niche programming expensive relative to its measurable return. Kasitov did not face the same constraints. The internet does not charge per channel. The cost of streaming a niche sport to 500,000 people is not fundamentally different from streaming a mainstream sport to 5 million. This meant that Cassette V could afford to broadcast judo, beach soccer, futsal, gymnastics, handball, skateboarding, and table tennis to audiences that had never seen those sports on prime time in their lives. During the Paris 2024 Olympics, it did exactly that, pooling millions of viewers to events that Brazilian free-to-air television had always buried in overnight programming. Each of those broadcasts served two purposes simultaneously. The obvious purpose was reaching the audience of that specific event. The less obvious purpose was demonstrating to athletes, federations, clubs, and sponsors across every sport that there was now a viable alternative to the broadcast gatekeepers. The ecosystem that had been exclusively dependent on a small number of television companies for visibility and commercial value now had a different address it could turn to, and that structural change in the dependency relationship was more important to the long-term collapse of the monopoly than any single record audience number. By the time the Mundial de Clubes was played in 2025, Cassette had reached 35 million unique devices on YouTube during the competition. an audience that exceeded the combined subscription base of multiple cable and satellite sports channels. The venture capital that had waited to see whether the Qatar results were a one-time event had seen enough. In April 2024, General Atlantic and the private investment arm of XP Investimentos put money into live mode, the same category of institutional investors that fund some of the largest companies in Brazil had decided that a YouTube channel was the structural winner in the future of Brazilian sports. That assessment from that category of investor is as close as financial markets get to a formal declaration that the old order is over. The coup de grace for the 2026 World Cup, Cassidov acquired the rights to all 104. Read that again slowly, because it takes a moment to fully register. The tournament that Globo had owned for more than 2 decades, the event that had been the crown of its sports rights portfolio, the single most watched sporting competition in the history of Brazil. Every single game, exclusively on YouTube. Globo retained rights to slightly more than half. The SBT secured 32 games. The rest belonged to Cassit. For the first time in a generation, the majority of World Cup games played in Brazil were broadcast primarily through the internet by a company that had not existed when the previous World Cup was held. The commercial outcome matched the scale of the acquisition. Casitov negotiated approximately 2 billion reais in sponsorships for the tournament. In partnership with YouTube, 11 major brands signed on, including breweries, banks, food delivery applications, and automobile manufacturers. The master sponsorship rate was around 5 million reais per slot, an operation that had begun with the premise of broadcasting 22 free games on the internet was now structuring commercial deals in the range that cable sports packages had historically commanded. It is worth being honest about one element of that commercial base. A significant portion of the sponsorship revenue came from sports betting companies, a sector that has grown explosively in Brazil and that carries an intense public debate about its social effects. The revenue model of Cassidov is not separable from the expansion of the betting industry into Brazilian sport, and the scale of that dependency is relevant to any complete account of how the business actually works. On the night of the opening match, Brazil against Morocco, the Cassidov stream peaked at 12,700,000 simultaneous screens. According to the tracking platform Playboard, the largest audience ever recorded on YouTube for a football match. The previous record, also held by Casad V, had been less than half that. The signal delay relative to television did not cost them viewers. The audience grew during the game. The monopoly that had taken 40 years to build had been formally broken, not eroded, not gradually reduced, not politely competed with, but broken. The channel that had defined Brazilian football broadcasting for 4 decades was now a minority rights holder in its signature event, losing audiences it had retained through structural locking rather than genuine preference. Watching a YouTube channel it had not taken seriously 4 years earlier set records. The television industry had never come close to reaching the economics of what was actually stolen. One of the clearest ways to understand how complete the transfer of power was is to follow the advertising money, because advertising money goes where the audience goes, and the audience is no longer where it was. For 40 years, a brand that wanted to reach the Brazilian football audience during a major tournament had essentially one conversation to have. You went to Globo. You paid Globo's rates, which reflected the fact that Globo was the only place where that audience, that scale, could be reached. There was no negotiation of principle, only of price, because the principle was not negotiable. Globo had the audience because the structure made it impossible for anyone else to have it. The 2026 World Cup changed that equation in a way that cannot be reversed by any single rights deal or any amount of investment in broadcast infrastructure. 11 major brands paid approximately 2 billion reais to sponsor Cassidov's coverage of the tournament. Some of those brands had historically been Globo sponsors. Some were new to sports advertising at that scale. All of them were responding to the same commercial reality. The audience they needed to reach was now on YouTube more than it was on television. The people watching Cassid were watching voluntarily rather than because there was nothing else available. And voluntary attention from an engaged audience is worth more per minute to an advertiser than passive reception from an audience that has not made an active choice to be there. This is the aspect of the collapse that will take the longest to reverse, if it reverses at all. Rights can be reacquired. Technology can be upgraded. Broadcast infrastructure can be rebuilt. But the pricing power that comes from being the only serious buyer in a market, the ability to set terms rather than respond to competition, that is gone. The next rights negotiation that Globo enters for a major sporting event will be a competitive auction rather than a bilateral arrangement with a captive rights holder. The price it pays will reflect what the rights are worth in a competitive market. That price will be lower than what it paid when it was the only bidder, and it will come with audience numbers that are lower than they were when it was the only broadcaster. The commercial math of the monopoly has been broken as permanently as the monopoly itself. What the television industry lost and why it cannot get it back. The numbers tell part of the story. What the numbers do not tell is why the loss is structural rather than cyclical. Why this is not a period of disruption that will eventually normalize back to the old order when the novelty wears off. The answer is in the nature of what was actually lost. Globo did not lose the World Cup because a competitor outbid it for rights. It lost the World Cup because a competitor had an asset it could not replicate, and that asset was worth more than money in the rights market. The asset was trust. Specifically, the pre-existing relationship between one presenter and an audience of tens of millions of people who had chosen to spend their time with him, on their own initiative, with no marketing budget behind the choice. That relationship had been building for years, on Twitch and YouTube, in streams where the audience was never treated as passive, where the presenter reacted as a fan rather than as a broadcaster, where the content was participation rather than transmission. Television broadcasting is fundamentally transmission. The signal goes one way. The institution decides what you see and how you see it. The audience's role is to watch and accept. This is not a flaw in the medium. It was an efficient design for a world in which reaching a large audience required expensive infrastructure that only a small number of entities could maintain. The internet did not just reduce the cost of that infrastructure. It replaced the logic entirely. On the internet, distribution is nearly free and nearly universal. The scarcity is not in the pipe. It is in the attention. An attention is not something you can buy once and hold. It requires continuous renewal. Every time the audience turns on a stream, it is making a fresh choice about where to spend its time. The incumbent advantage that protected Globo's sports rights monopoly for 40 years, the impossibility of competing with its distribution infrastructure, has no equivalent in a world where distribution is free. The new advantage is relational. And relational advantages belong to whoever built the relationship, not to whoever had the money to build the infrastructure. Kazativ did not build its relationship by being a media company. It built the relationship before it was a media company, when it was just a person talking to an audience in real time, and then transformed that relationship into a media company once the legal and market conditions made it possible to do so. Globo cannot replicate this process. It cannot go back in time and build a different kind of relationship with a generation of viewers it spent 40 years broadcasting at rather than with. It cannot hire its way to authenticity. It cannot produce intimacy at scale. It can invest in streaming infrastructure, improve its digital products, and compete more aggressively in the rights market. All of those things are happening. None of them address the core asymmetry, which is that the audience Kazativ built trusts it in a way that the audience Globo reached never had a reason to. This dynamic is not unique to Brazil. The global collapse of the sports TV model. What happened in Brazil between 2022 and 2026 is a compressed version of a process occurring simultaneously across every major sports market in the world, driven by the same structural forces operating at different speeds in different regulatory and cultural environments. Amazon Prime Video holds exclusive rights to NFL Thursday Night Football in the United States, Premier League matches in the United Kingdom and France, and Champions League football in Germany. It entered those markets not because it had a history in sports broadcasting, but because it had an audience base and a distribution infrastructure that sports rights holders found more valuable than the traditional broadcast alternatives. Apple TV Plus holds rights to Major League Soccer in North America and has been publicly linked to bids for much larger packages. DAZN, a streaming-only sports broadcaster that did not exist before 2016, now holds rights to boxing, motorsport, and football leagues in multiple markets. In the United Kingdom, TNT Sports, a streaming and cable service, competes directly with traditional broadcast television for Premier League rights. The pattern is consistent across every market where it has played out. Traditional broadcasters that built their position on distribution scarcity are losing ground to platforms that reach their audiences through the internet, where distribution is not scarce. The rights holders, the leagues and clubs and federations, are responding rationally to this shift by diversifying their broadcasting relationships. Having a single dominant buyer is only advantageous to the rights holder if that buyer genuinely has no competition. Once viable competition exists, rights holders benefit from fragmentation. The disaggregation of the Brazilian market through the Lei do Mandante is a local legal expression of a structural tendency that is playing out through market forces everywhere else. The question is not whether traditional sports broadcasting will survive. Large, established broadcasters with deep rights portfolios and loyal audiences will remain significant players in most markets for years. Globo will not disappear. The BBC will not stop broadcasting sport. Sky Sports will not close. The question is whether they will remain the dominant force, whether the assumption of inevitable renewal that has sustained their position will continue to hold, and whether the prices they pay for rights will continue to reflect a level of control they no longer actually exercise. The speed at which the Brazilian television monopoly collapsed is exceptional. 4 years from the launch of a YouTube channel, 2 full World Cup exclusivity is a timeline that does not have a direct parallel in any other major sports market. But the underlying forces that made it possible are not local. Brazil happened to reach this outcome first, and at the most extreme scale, with a single competitor holding the entire competition rather than a partial slate. The legal framework of the Lei do Mandante accelerated the fragmentation of rights that happened more gradually elsewhere. The existence of a pre-built audience, in the form of Casimiro's following, meant that the new end did not need to construct its relationship with viewers from zero, collapsing the timeline from years to months, and the specific economics of the Brazilian advertising market, where the gap between reaching a premium urban audience and a general mass audience is commercially significant, meant that Cacite's ability to deliver a specific, verified, engaged viewership was worth more per impression to advertisers than raw television ratings. But the outcome itself, a dominant traditional broadcaster losing its position in the most prestigious event in its rights portfolio to a digitally native competitor, is what is happening everywhere. The global sports broadcasting industry has been watching. The conclusion being drawn is the same one the Brazilian advertising market already drew. The old model of audience captivity through distribution scarcity is over. The gate is not just open. It has been taken off its hinges. What the next chapter looks like, Casete V, which broke the monopoly, is itself not exempt from the dynamics it exploited. The company that disrupted Brazilian sports broadcasting now controls enough of the market that it faces its own questions about concentration of power. Live Mode, the company behind Casete V, simultaneously negotiates the sale of sports rights for clubs and federations and operates the channel that purchases those rights. Sitting on both sides of a transaction generates the same structural conflict of interest that regulators scrutinize when traditional media companies do it. The Brazilian legislature has already requested an investigation. The concerns were not exclusively commercial. During the 2022 Brazilian elections, a manipulated image connected to a political figure circulated through platforms where Cacete's audience lived at scale. The episode forced a question that no football streaming channel had ever been required to answer. What are the editorial responsibilities of a platform that is, in practice, a primary news environment for millions of people who came for the match and stayed for everything else? The Portuguese media regulator drew its own conclusion. A platform of that reach is a media entity, and media entities carry accountability that a YouTube channel's terms of service does not cover. This is, historically, what successful disruption looks like from the inside. You challenge the establishment by being smaller, faster, and less constrained by the norms that protect the existing order. And then, if you succeed, you become large enough that the same institutional logic that governed the establishment starts to govern you. The audience that made all of this possible will eventually make the same judgment about Kasitov that it made about Globo, whether the relationship still feels genuine, whether the content still reflects its interests, whether the trust that was built in a bedroom streaming football reactions still survives the pressure of international investment funds, Cayman Islands holding companies, and billion-real sponsorship negotiations. That judgment has not yet been made. The 12,700,000 screens that turned on for the 2026 opener suggest it has not been made yet. But the mechanism that allowed one broadcaster to hold 200 million people's sports viewing habits captive for 40 years no longer exists. The infrastructure monopoly is gone. The rights monopoly is fractured. The audience's relationship with a single broadcaster is no longer a function of having no alternative. It is now a genuine choice made freely every time they turn on a stream. The human story behind the structural story. There is a human element to this story that deserves its moment, not because it changes the structural analysis, but because it puts a face on why the disruption was possible at the specific time it happened. 8 months of successful streaming was enough to reach the number Casemiro had set as his first target. Amadou retired. The counter in South Rio was left behind. The promise that had started everything. The quiet one made by a son watching his father stand in the same place for too many years was the first thing finished. The commercial infrastructure around that promise was built by people who understood exactly what Casemiro had, even before he did. Edgar Dainez and Sergio Lopes, the founders of Live Mode, had built a Sport Interativo years earlier and sold it to Turner, a global media group. They had spent years acquiring disaggregated rights under the new legal framework. They had the industry knowledge, the relationships with clubs and federations, and the technical understanding of how rights, markets actually worked. What they did not have was an audience. When they partnered with Casemiro in January 2022, they brought together the two things that the incumbent had never needed to separate because it had always controlled both. The irony that connects the threads. Casemiro had been an intern at eSport Interativo, the company that Dainez and Lopes had built and sold. The men who became his business partners were, in a structural sense, the predecessors of the predecessors he displaced. The intern who had been paid 500 reais a month at the first disruption of Brazilian sports broadcasting grew up to lead the second one in partnership with the people who had led the first. In November 2025, the commercial structure of the partnership was reorganized. Live Mode acquired full ownership of Casif's Brazilian operations. Casemiro moved into a global holding structure based in the Cayman Islands, a larger stake in a larger enterprise. The deal valued what he had built at a number never publicly disclosed. He continued to appear on screen as before. In interviews around the time of the restructuring, he described himself with a consistency that suggested the description was sincere rather than managed. His words, repeated in multiple contexts. I am a journalist. I am a normal guy. I do not see myself as businessman Casemiro. This was said by a man whose company had just negotiated 2 billion reais in sponsorships, whose global holding structure was domiciled in the Cayman Islands, and whose stake in that structure had been reorganized in a deal whose valuation was never made public. Businessman Casemiro had apparently been operating for some time without requesting the title. The audience has continued to show up. The relationship, for now, survives the structure that was built around it. The question that remains: the monopoly is dead. The gate is open. The audience has demonstrated in numbers so large they cannot be disputed that when given a genuine choice about how to watch sport, it chooses differently than it did when the choice was not available. What is not yet clear is what the new structure will look like once it is finished forming. Kasitov has enough market power in Brazilian sports broadcasting to attract conflict of interest investigations and regulatory scrutiny in 2 countries. The company that arrived as the challenger is now large enough to be challenged. The investment funds that backed it have expectations about returns that will, over time, create pressure on the very elements of the business that made it successful in the first place. The audience that chose Kazativ, because it felt authentic and independent, will eventually have to decide whether it still feels that way when the company behind it is a vertically integrated, internationally funded, Cayman Islands domiciled media and rights group. These are not hypothetical problems. They are the same problems that every successful disruptor eventually faces, and they tend to resolve in one of two directions. Either the disruptor preserves enough of what made it distinctive to maintain its competitive advantage, or it is gradually absorbed into the institutional logic of the industry it disrupted, creating space for the next challenger to do to it what it did to the incumbent. Globo has been the incumbent for 40 years. It built a monopoly on distribution scarcity that lasted until distribution became cheap. The lesson of what happened to Globo is available to anyone paying attention. The conflict of interest allegations? These are all indicators that the organizational logic that turns challengers into incumbents is already operating inside. Gazette! Whether the audience notices and when is the next chapter. For now, the 40-year monopoly is gone. 200 million Brazilians have a choice about where to watch football that they did not have 4 years ago. 12,700,000 of them made that choice on one specific evening in June 2026. And they made it clearly enough that no one in the Brazilian media industry will spend the next decade pretending the old order is still standing. The gate is off its hinges. The key is gone. The architecture that cannot be rebuilt. Here is the final thing to understand about what happened to the Brazilian sports television monopoly. It cannot be rebuilt, even if the underlying technology reverts to something that would theoretically enable it. Monopolies in distribution require that the audience has no alternative. The 40-year monopoly that Globo held over Brazilian sports broadcasting existed because the audience literally could not watch football on any other platform. The infrastructure required to broadcast to millions of simultaneous viewers was expensive, technically complex, and limited to the handful of entities with the capital and the regulatory licenses to build it. The internet ended that scarcity permanently. Distribution to millions of simultaneous viewers is now available to anyone with a broadband connection and a platform account. The technical barrier is gone and will not return. The regulatory barrier, the broadcast licensing system that kept competitors out, applies to spectrum allocation and does not constrain internet distribution. The capital barrier, the costs of building and maintaining a broadcast infrastructure, has been reduced to near zero for internet delivery. None of these conditions can be reversed. The flaw has been removed from the monopoly's foundations. What this means practically is that even if Kazavé collapsed tomorrow, even if live mode went bankrupt and the entire operation ceased to exist, Globo could not recapture the position it held before 2022. The audience has seen the alternative. It knows that watching football does not require accepting the broadcast conditions that a single company decides to impose. The knowledge that an alternative is possible once acquired changes the calculus permanently. This is the deep structure of what happened, not the specific company that won, or the specific contract that was signed, or the specific presenter whose audience made the whole thing possible. The deep structure is the permanent elimination of the conditions under which a broadcast monopoly in sports could be sustained. 200 million Brazilians spent 4 decades watching football the way one company decided they should watch it, on the screens it owned, with the narrators it chose, during the commercial breaks it sold. They did not choose this. They simply had no alternative. The moment they had won, 12,700,000 of them used it in a single evening. The question was never whether they would choose differently. The question was only whether anyone would ever give them the chance to. The gate is not just open. The gate no longer exists. And 40 years of power, built on the assumption that the gate would always be there, has gone with it.